You might be missing a key ingredient. Hey, welcome to The Whole Truth, where I am taking you through the entire Bible from Genesis all the way to Revelation, and we are not skipping anything. So if that sounds good to you, reach down and hit the little subscribe button below. And if you want to support the channel, you can do that with likes, comments, and shares. It costs you nothing to do those. And if you'd like to support the channel financially, then you can do that over at Patreon, patreon.com/thewholetruth. And then you'll be able to join in as a Patreon, and you'll get all of the notes that come along with these studies. Now, today we are in Judges chapter 18. And in Judges chapter 18, we're seeing the culmination of this story that happened in the last chapter with this guy named Micah. Micah stole some money from his mom. Then he used that money to, he tried to give it back to her because she cursed it. Then she took that money and gave it back to him and said, well, I dedicated this to you so you could make an image. She gives him like 100 years worth of money all at once as an inheritance, basically. He takes the money and makes an ephod and a shrine and hires a priest. His mom takes the money and makes carved images, probably trying to make an image of the Lord, which they're not supposed to do. And this whole thing snowballed as you see this guy being disobedient to what God had told him to do, or what he told Israelite people to do, and trying to worship in his own way. Well, today in chapter 18, we now pick up in the middle of that story as this tribe of Dan comes through the same area where Micah is and this Levite is, who he hired as a priest. If you're confused about all that stuff, go back and watch the last video. It'll make a whole lot more sense. And so now the Danites are coming through, and they decide that they want the idols. They want the priest. They want the blessings of God, but they don't really want God. You know, this is something that I think we hear throughout the modern church, is those who seem to want the blessings that God offers. They want the miracles that God offers. They want the healing that God offers. They want deliverance that God offers, but they don't seem to really want God. And it's seen in their actions. This is what we see out of the Danites. And remember, there's this line. It'll open today in chapter 18. It'll be the opening line of the chapter. But let's read the first, read the first 10 verses together, and then we'll talk about them. Let's do it together. Go get your Bible. Come read it with me. Judges 18, verses 1 to 10. In those days, there was no king in Israel. And in those days, the tribe of the Danites was seeking an inheritance for itself to dwell in. For until that day, their inheritance among the tribes of Israel had not fallen to them. And so the children of Dan sent 5 men of their family from their territory, men of valor from Zorah and Eshtaol, to spy out the land and search it. And they said to them, go search the land. And so they went to the mountains of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, and lodged there. Now, while they were at the house of Micah, they recognized the voice of the young Levite. They turned aside and said to him, who brought you here? And what are you doing in this place? What do you have here? And he said to them, thus and so Micah did for me. And he hired me, and I've become his priest. And so they said to him, please inquire of God, that we may know whether the journey on which we will go will be prosperous. The priest said to them, go in peace. The presence of the Lord be with you on your way. And so the 5 men departed and went to Laish, and they saw the people who were there, how they dwelt safely in the manner of the Sidonians, quiet and secure. There were no rulers in the land who might put them to shame for anything. They were far from the Sidonians, and they had no ties with anyone. And then the spies came back to their brethren at Zorah and Eshtaol, and their brethren said to them, what is your report? And so they said, arise, go up against them, for we have seen the land, and indeed it is very good. Would you do nothing? Do not hesitate to go and enter and possess the land. And when you go, you will come to a secure people and a large land, for God has given it into your hands, a place where there is no lack of anything that is on the earth. Okay, so you see, the Danites are trying to find a place to dwell. Now, this is a time when there is no king in Israel. So this is the time of the judges leading up to the time of the kings. That's Saul and David and Solomon and so on. We're leading into the time of the kings in Israel. But before we get there, we have to understand the story. That's the picture of the whole Bible. Okay, so we're understanding the story that's happening in the whole Bible when we see that there is no king in Israel. It also helps us to understand why these wild things are happening, why these chaotic scenes are happening, especially here in the end of the book of Judges. So here's the Danites, and it says that they're looking for a place. Their lot had not fallen to them. Now, many would say that, and they may be right, that the Danites, this is early on in the book of Judges. This is early on in their history, and therefore they had not had their land yet. I don't know that I'm completely in agreement with that. It seems to me like maybe they didn't take the land that they were supposed to take. I think it's like Joshua chapter 19, that they're told to take a particular set of land. And they're told where to go in Joshua. Joshua told them where their land would be, and here they're searching out for land. I mean, regardless, you can't argue with me on that point. They were given a place to go. All the tribes were given a place to go. Now Dan is going to look for a place, but why are they going to look for a place? Well, because their lot hadn't fallen to them yet. In other words, they hadn't taken over the land. At this point, they have not taken over the land that they're supposed to take over. Well, you might say, well, wait a second. Like, if they were given the land, why didn't they just take that? That's kind of my point. Like, why didn't they take the land that they were supposed to take? Why are they out searching for land? Maybe their land was still inhabited with people from Canaan, even if it was early on, but they knew where they were supposed to go. They knew where they were supposed to be, and they're not there. They're going to seek somewhere else. And then look at what happens when they go to seek that other place. They go to seek another place, and what do they find? They find the house of Micah. That's the guy from the last chapter, the guy who tried to create his own system of religion. They find Micah, and they hear a voice. They recognize the voice, like, hey, that's a Levite. And they recognize this Levite. They're like, what are you doing here? And he says, well, I'm here because Micah hired me. He did all this stuff for me. He gave me money, and he gave me sustenance, and he gave me food. He said, just come and be a priest for him. So he's made me his priest. Now I'm a priest here. And they're like, oh, well, since you're a priest, tell us if this is going to be a prosperous journey for us. Go inquire of the Lord. We don't see him going and inquiring of the Lord. We don't see Micah going and inquiring of the Lord. He says, go in peace. You're going to be prosperous. It's going to be great. Now, remember, they're searching for something that they've already told where they're supposed to be. And now they're searching for it. And this priest, who's not really a priest, he's a Levite who had wandered off and been hired for 10 shekels and a shirt. And he says, go in peace, it's going to be great. Well, they go out, they find this land, and they go, oh, it looks great. It's not, they don't really have a lot of ties with other people that they could call on. If we attack this land, it'll be easy for the taking. Now, to be completely honest with you, you have to remember that Israel was promised this land, and much of what they were doing was the punishment for the people who were in this land. So this is not me making an outcry of, this people who were a peaceful people who weren't bothering anybody, and then the Danites came in and took over. No, that's not necessarily the point. The point is not that they weren't doing anything bad. The Lord was bringing his retribution on the land of Canaan by sending Israel in. So that's not necessarily my problem with the story. My problem is the fact that Dan is in an area that they're not supposed to be in, inquiring of God through a priest that they're really not supposed to be inquiring in. Do you see what I'm saying? And what they want to know is what God is going to say about this. Is God going to bless this? Is this going to be prosperous? And they go and spout the land. They find this area that they think is good. They come back to their brothers and like, well, here's what we found. And they're like, well, why wait? Go take it. Go take it. The Lord's being good to us. The Lord's blessing us with this. Notice that they want the blessing of the confidence that God gives. They want the blessing of confidence that God would give, but they're doing it without the direction that God gave. If you want the confidence that you're doing the thing God's called you to do, why not start by following the directions that he's given you to do it? Have you ever put something together that just seemed like it wasn't going to work? I've done this on several occasions with maybe say like a bookshelf or like a bedding, like an IKEA piece of furniture. And you get these like little bolts, or like put this bolt in here and turn it this direction so that the little cross faces this way, and put the cam side on this and put this here and take A and put it to B and take it here and make sure. And you do all these little steps. You got all these little parts. And then it's like all of the sudden, it comes together. I have another illustration too. I once was given a Rubik's Cube, and I couldn't solve the Rubik's Cube. I'd never learned how to do that, and I just like thought it was like trying to put one piece, but whenever you turn one piece, you're affecting like a whole side. And, I was always able to maybe get one side to all be the right color, but I could never go any further. Well, then I had my daughter's boyfriend. He was over one day, and he does it in like a minute. I mean, just like maybe not even a minute, just brrr, and then done. He's done. I'm like, what in the world? He just did a whole Rubik's Cube. And so he taught me that you not only do you do the first side, but you have to do it in layers. So when you do the first side, you make that the bottom, and now you look and there's like a row of squares that go around, and then the next row of squares, and then the next row of squares, and then you do the top one last. And so you kind of picture it in layers, not necessarily in sides. And so he taught me that trick first, and then he taught me these algorithms. He literally wrote them down for me. And it was very interesting because you could get basically 5 sides done. You could get 1, 2, 3, 4 sides in the bottom side, but you still had the top side to do. And he said, now this one's the scariest. And he said, you got to follow this algorithm. So it's like this side like this, and this side like this, and this side like this, and this. And he said, you just keep twisting it over and over and over in this same algorithm. And he said, it's going to look all scrambled. But then when you get to like the final couple of turns, you're going to go, oh, it's coming all back together, and everything will be together, and that last side will be done. And sure enough, that's exactly what was happening. Twisting and turning, and now all the pieces look mixed up. But he's like, trust it, trust the process. And so you keep doing the same twists and turns, this side one way and this side another way and this side back this way and so on. And you just keep twisting it, and it looks all messed up. And then it was like he was right. Sure enough, all of a sudden the last like 4 or 5 turns, you twist. Oh, it's coming together. And then bam, it's like all together all at once. And you see what I'm saying there? Like if I follow the directions, then it all comes together. And that's what I'm trying to say here. They had directions. Dan had directions from God. And even though their land maybe was still inhabited by Canaanite people, they were supposed to be there. If they want the confidence that it's going to work, what they're doing is going to work, they need to follow the directions that God gave. From that point on, whenever I would do the Rubik's Cube, I would always get to that last step, that last side, and I would remember, like, follow the process, follow the directions. That's what God wants us to do, is follow the directions that he's given us. Now, look what happens next in the story. Pick up with me now in verse 11, and we'll read through 17. And 600 men of the family of the Danites went from Zorah and Eshtaol, armed with weapons of war. They went up and encamped in Kirjath-jearim in Judah. And therefore they called that place Mahanadan. To this day, there it is, west of Kirjath-jearim. And they passed from there to the mountains of Ephraim and came to the house of Micah. And then five men who had gone out to spy the country of Laish answered and said to their brethren, do you know that there is in these houses an ephod, household idols, a carved image, and molded images? Now therefore consider what you should do. So they turned aside there and came to the house of the young Levite man, to the house of Micah, and greeted him. The 600 men were armed with their weapons of war, who were the children of Dan, stood by the entrance of the gate. And then the 5 men who had gone to spy out the land went up. Entering there, they took the carved images, the ephod, the household idols, and the molded images. The priest stood at the entrance of the gate with the 600 men who were armed with weapons of war. Now, I want you to get the idea of what just happened. 600 men. So remember, Dan needed a place to go. They sent 5 men to go spy out a place to go. They stayed at the house of Micah. They tried to talk with the Levite, the priest, to get his blessing. He gave him the blessing. They went out, spied out the land, came back, said the land was good. So they gathered up 600 men. They're going to go take this land of Laish. They're going to go take the land. On their way there, they're passing back up the house of Micah. The 5 guys who had gone in to begin with look at the 600 guys and go, just so you all know, there's an ephod in there. Remember, an ephod is a garment only for priests. So there's an ephod in there for the priest. There's molded images and graven images, and there's a shrine there, and they've got a priest there. Now, what should have happened, how it should have ended, is that those 600 men should have stood up for what was right and said, that shouldn't be. Micah shouldn't have that in his house. But instead, guess what they do? They send in the 5 men. They all stand at the gate. So now 595 men, the 600 men, stand at the gate, and they send in the 5 men to go take the stuff that Micah shouldn't have, they said, go take it. And so the 5 men went in and they took what was in Micah's house, the shrine, the images, the ephod, and even the priest. They take the stuff that Micah has and they bring it out for themselves. They're going to take it with them into this land of Laish where they're going to go. Now, why in the world would they take that stuff? You ready? Because they wanted the presence of God. They wanted the presence of God. They wanted God to go with them. Remember, if those images, which I believe they probably were, trying to make an image, Micah was trying to make an image of God, who he believed God looked like, or what he believed God looked like, or whatever. He tried to make an image of God, and he was trying to worship God, though it was totally misguided. Might have been sincere, but he was wrong. That was last video. Now you see these guys, they want that presence of God. You know what's in that house? I'm putting this in quotes for those of you who can't see this if you're listening on a podcast or just listening while you're doing something else. I'm putting this in quotes, that they wanted the presence of God. They wanted God to be with them. So they wanted the stuff that they thought was godly, if you will. They wanted the stuff that represented God. They wanted God's presence with them, but they didn't want to be obedient to God. You know how to have God's presence? Be obedient to what he says. If you want him to go with you, then do the things that he says. Go where he tells you to go, and he goes with you. As a matter of fact, go where he says to go, and he goes before you. If you want God to be with you, be obedient to him. But they're not being obedient to God. They know they're not supposed to have carved images. They know they're not supposed to have molded images. They know that they're not supposed to have an ephod. That's all stuff. No, the images they're not supposed to have at all. And the ephod is something that's supposed to be at the tabernacle, as is the priest is supposed to be at the tabernacle. But instead, they want to try to bring God with them. Now, there's something right there. How many of us want to act and move forward on something and then bring God with us into the plans that we've created instead of following what God has called us into? Let that sink in one more time. How many of us want to bring God into what we're doing instead of going where God has told us to go? Man. And so what happens next in the story that they've stolen these idols and stolen this ephod and stolen the priest? Well, pick up with me in verse 18. When these went into Micah's house and took the carved images, the ephod, the household idols, and the molded images, the priest said to them, "What are you doing?" And they said to him, "Be quiet. Put your hand over your mouth and come with us. Be a father and a priest to us, for it's better for you to be a priest to the household of, for is it better for you to be a priest of a household of one man? Or that you be the priest of a tribe and a family of Israel?" So the priest's heart was glad. He took the ephod and the household idols and the carved image and took his place among the people. And then they turned and departed and put the little ones, the livestock, and the goods in front of them. And then when they were a good way from the house of Micah, the men who were in the houses near Micah's house gathered together and overtook the children of Dan. And they called out to the children of Dan. So they turned around and said to Micah, "What ails you that you gather such a company?" And so he said, "You have taken my gods, which I made, and the priest you have gone, and the priest, and you have gone away. Now what more do I have? How can you say to me, what ails you?" The children of Dan said to him, "Do not let your voice be heard among us, lest angry men fall upon you, and you lose your life with the lives of your household." And then the children of Dan went their way. And when Micah saw that they were too strong for him, he turned and went back to his house. Oh my goodness. Dan steals all the stuff from Micah's house. The other men who live near Micah, they come out and stand in the way. They block him. And then here comes Micah. You can see Micah is not happy. Now there's a standoff. Now we don't know how many other people were in the houses. Let's say there was 100. Let's say there were 200. I don't know. You got a group of 600. You got a group of maybe 100 or 200. You got the people that were in the houses near Micah. They block off the streets and they say, not going through. Not till Micah gets to talk to you. Micah comes out. They turn around and they look at Micah and they go, "What ails you?" He's like, "You just stole my idols. You stole the gods that I'd created. My silver. You're taking my ephod. You're taking my priest. What do I have left? You're taking everything I have." And they look at him and they say, "We better be quiet. We don't want to hear another word from you, because if you do, just saying, somebody might get angry. Angry men might fall upon you and you might lose your life." You can almost hear this like mob-like threat coming from them. Micah realizes he's not going to be able to overpower them. By the way, pay attention as well to the fact that Micah's priest Levite, the Levite priest who was willing to give up his righteousness to come and follow with Micah for 10 shekels and a shirt. Now he starts to see, guess what? Even more dollar signs. I can go follow with these guys. I mean, that's what they said. Like, why be a priest to one household when you could be a priest to a whole tribe? The Levite's just climbing the ladder right here, isn't he? I mean, he's just climbing the corporate ladder of religion. Hey, you're right. I mean, if this guy can give me 10 shekels and a shirt, what could the whole group of Dan give me? And so now this Levite's going to go with Dan, and he's got the ephod, he's got the stuff. Micah realizes, I can't stand against him. So Micah turns around and goes, he's probably ticked, but he goes back in his house, and he's not going to say a word because he doesn't want to die over this. And the men of Dan just took what they wanted. You know what we see is that Dan wanted their actions without any accountability. How many of us find ourselves in the same situation, that the thing that we're doing is wrong, but we want it with no accountability? That's what Micah wants. Micah wanted to have all these false gods and have this place of worship that he had created. He wanted it to be his own way, but he wanted that with no consequences. Now the Danites have come. They've taken him. They've taken the priest that was up for hire. They've taken him as well, which would only make sense. You see each person. Then the Danites, the same thing. They're wanting to take them. They don't want Micah to say anything to them. They say, well, you better be quiet or angry men are going to fall upon you. They want to be able to do what they want, but they don't want to have any accountability, and they don't want to have, they want to be able to have their actions with no accountability whatsoever. Their actions here demonstrate a disregard for God's commands and what somebody's willing to do for their own personal gain. And this reminds me of humanity that does the same thing. We disregard what God has commanded us to try to do things our own way. And then we try to protect the thing that we shouldn't have been doing in the first place. We want to have our actions with no accountability whatsoever. But do you know what we read in the scriptures? Let me read this to you. In Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 22, the blessing of the Lord makes one rich, and he adds no sorrow with it. You know what Jesus said? In Matthew 16:26, for what profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world, but loses his own soul? Dan looks like, at this point, it looks like Dan's winning. Like Dan could overpower Micah. Micah can't even stand against him. You know what? All of Micah's silver, his 100 years worth of silver that he had gathered up, it doesn't mean anything if they're going to kill him. It's worthless. But now you've got these men of Dan, they're taking what they believe to be like this presence of God. They're taking it with them, but it's of nothing. As a matter of fact, it only brings a curse with it. And look at how the story ends. It doesn't get better. It's just as bad all the way through the end. Look at verse 27. So they took the things Micah had made and the priest who had belonged to him and went to Laish, to a people quiet and secure, and they struck them with the edge of the sword and burned the city with fire. There was no deliverer because it was far from Sidon, and they had no ties with anyone. It was in the valley that belongs to Beth Rahab, and so they rebuilt the city and dwelt there, and they called the name of the city Dan, after the name of Dan, their father, who was born in Israel. However, the name of the city formerly was Laish. And then the children of Dan set up for themselves the carved image. Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh, and his sons were priests to the tribe of Dan until the day of the captivity of the land. And so they set up for themselves Micah's carved image, which he made all the time that the house of God was in Shiloh. Now, this last thing that I want you to see is this. They want all the benefits that would come from being godly, but they don't want to do it with any righteousness. They go in and they take the peaceful people. They go in and they slay them with the edge of the sword. I'm not really condemning them for that, because just because the people seemed peaceful doesn't necessarily, just because they were peaceful doesn't mean that they weren't sinful. And as I've already said, there was a punishment that was happening for the people inside of Canaan. So I'm not even really talking about the fact that they went in and destroyed the city per se, but it's the fact that what they wanted to do here was to have all of the benefits of having this city. So they have their city, they set up their priesthood, they set up their images, they call themselves Dan. It used to be Laish, but they call it Dan. They want to have all the benefits, but here's what they don't want to have: any righteousness. because they weren't supposed to have their own priest like that, not in the way that they had done. They weren't supposed to set up priests from Manasseh. Priests were supposed to come from Dan, but they'd set up the children of Manasseh as their priest, which would only make sense because they've got a Levite who probably is not supposed to be a priest, claiming himself to be a priest as well. They've set up their images. They've set up their city. They've made it look as if they have everything. But did you pay attention to the fact that it was that way? They had those priests and they had those things that way until the time of the captivity. Do you know what happened in Israel after this? Israel ends up with a king, King Saul. After King Saul is King David. After King David is King Solomon. After King Solomon, you end up with a king named Rehoboam. Rehoboam has all 12 tribes of Israel, but he doesn't listen to them as they say, hey, don't tax us as much as Solomon did. Don't make us build as much as Solomon made us build. Well, he says, nope, I'm going to whip you harder. I'm going to make it harder on you. I'm going to make your life miserable. And you know what happens to the kingdom? It gets, I said Rehoboam. That's Jeroboam. Jeroboam. That's what happened. That's what he said. God splits the kingdom and he gives the 10 tribes, they call them the 10 northern tribes, gives them to a guy named Rehoboam. So Jeroboam has some of the tribes and Rehoboam has some of the tribes. Rehoboam has the 2.5 tribes in the south where Judah is, and Jeroboam has all the tribes in the north. Do you know what happens, what they do to keep everybody, what Jeroboam does to keep everybody from going down into Jerusalem to go worship? Do you know what Jeroboam does? He sets up a golden calf. Do you know where he sets one up? One in Dan and one in Bethel. You know why he set them up in Dan and Bethel? To keep anybody, that's the northernmost and the southernmost cities. He was trying to keep the people from bridging the gap, from breaking through and going across to Judah, and then the people possibly coming back together. He's trying to protect what he had. So Dan, throughout their whole history, from the time of the judges, they had idols in their land. And then throughout all their history, you know what Dan had? An idol in their land. It never ended. It actually brought the very curse that ended Israel. Because of their idol worship, God eventually has enough, and God does to Israel what he was in the book of Judges doing to the Canaanites. God sends in the Assyrians to take out his people Israel, to take them out of the land because they kept worshiping idols. Don't you understand this, friends? You cannot do it without God. You can get this false sense of security and a false sense of success, but the truth is, if you really want to find fulfillment, it's only found in God, and you can only find God through his son, Jesus, who died for you and rose for you. And I hope that you found him. Well, I hope you've enjoyed today's video, and I hope you'll come back tomorrow as we get into Judges chapter 19. I'll see you then.